Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today we're going to be kicking off the 2018 year-end lists with my top 10 worst albums of 2018. As per usual, I like to get some of the bad stuff out of the way first, so I'm going to be talking about the worst albums first, though I do assure you my best albums of the year list, as well as best songs and all that other good stuff, will be around the corner soon enough. Now, this list is strictly based on my own opinion. These are the 10 worst albums I happen to hear in 2018, which means that if it's an album that I didn't hear in 2018, it also can't be on this list, regardless of how many bad things I may have heard about it or anything quite like that. So if it's not here on this list, maybe I just didn't hear it, or maybe I didn't think it was bad enough to be on this list. And if, maybe an album you like is on this list or something like that, it doesn't mean that I hate you or anything like that. It just means I didn't like this album. Nothing more to it, really. Also, all the albums that appear here on this list had to have been released from the start of 2018 to the end of 2018, as in January 1st, 2018 to December 31st, 2018. I know that might seem a bit obvious, but I know some people do their year-end list differently in that regard. So yeah, I just want to make that clear. With that said, let's get into my number 10 pick here today, the newest album from 3 Days Grace, Outsider. I wouldn't consider myself the biggest 3 Days Grace fan by any means. Even in my younger years when I listened to them a lot more than I do now, they weren't one of my favorite bands or anything quite like that. But I would still consider myself a casual fan of these guys at the least. But, even in recent years, most fans of this group tend to agree that the more recent output hasn't been all that great. And with albums like this, it's easy to see why. This album is essentially that one person in high school who thought that they were super edgy and super different and super special just because they listened to like post-grunge or rock music, like radio rock music, instead of just radio pop music. But really they're just like the same as everyone else at the end of the day. That's this album as a person, and a lot of the lyrics on this thing play right into that idea, particularly on tracks like I Am an Outsider, which is one of the most unbearably cringy cuts on this entire thing. Many of the other lyrics here are just painfully generic or boring at the end of the day, and you could say the same thing about much of the instrumentation and the vocal delivery too. It's just a really plain, run-of-the-mill post-grunge album that really isn't going to offer you anything new if you've heard some of the genre before. Yeah, there's not all too much to say about this thing outside of some of the painfully bad lyrics that pop up on this thing. Outside of those, it's just a really boring, uninteresting project. Next up on my list is probably going to be one of the more controversial picks here, considering the reaction to this album was fairly mixed. There were some people who really liked it, but there was also a fair amount of criticism thrown this album's way from people aside from myself. I'm talking about the newest album from Eminem, Kamikaze. Now, last year Eminem dropped Revival, an album that was critically panned and panned by fans as well. One of my least favorite albums as last year, personally speaking. And this year he decided to release another album in an attempt to correct the mistake he made last year. And most people would agree that this is a better album than Revival, and I would agree with that sentiment. This is definitely a better album than Revival. Eminem's rapping on this thing is much better, a lot of the features are more appropriate for an Eminem project, and the runtime is also a lot shorter, just a lot easier to digest overall. He fixed some of the big problems I had with Revival with this thing. But that doesn't make it necessarily a good album. And in the case of Kamikaze, yes, it's better than Revival, but it's still not a good album. My biggest problem with this album is the subject matter, really. The majority of this album is Eminem complaining about people disliking Revival and being too critical of Revival and all of that, even though most people were pretty fair with their criticisms and Revival was just a pretty terrible album at the end of the day. It's just Eminem throwing a temper tantrum for the entire album's runtime, pretty much, and it's not very appealing to listen to, especially when he doesn't really provide any interesting arguments as to why Revival was better than we've all thought, or why people were maybe too harsh on Revival, or were unfairly criticizing the album or something like that. He doesn't really do that. What he does is pretty much just yell curse words at people who didn't like his album and make immature jokes. That's all he does, really. And when he's not complaining about people disliking his last album, he's just going on about typical Eminem stuff, like his relationship with women, for example, on a couple of the cuts on this thing. Not awful, at least compared to some of the other subject matter on this thing, but still not super interesting, especially if you've heard Eminem's back catalog and you know that he's talked about this stuff a lot before, he doesn't bring anything new to the table in terms of this subject matter. It just feels like he ran out of things to complain about and just threw in some other tracks about other things that he typically talks about. On top of that, the production here still isn't all that great, and some of the features, while more appropriate for an Eminem album, still don't perform all that fantastically. It's just a bit of a misfire, this album, in my opinion. Definitely better than Revival, but still an album that I really can't see myself returning to, just because I can't deal with like another listen of this thing, just listening to Eminem complain over and over again about his last album being bad, when it really was very much deserving of a lot of the criticism and hate that it got, because it really was that bad. The next album on my list is another one that I feel like will be a bit more controversial, given that this thing had a fair bit of praise thrown its way, though it did also have its detractors outside of myself. I'm talking about the newest album from the 1975, A Brief Inquiry into Online Relationships. I really wanted to like this album. In fact, I wanted to love this album. I wanted this album to convert me into a 1975 fan, given that while I've liked tracks from this group here or there in the past, I've never been crazy about their albums as whole products. And this album, I was hoping was going to change that, but it didn't really. I can understand why people would like this thing, though. It's definitely their most experimental album to date. I just personally feel like all the experiments on this thing land flat on their faces instead of excelling. Lots of the experiments on this thing just amount to the band, essentially playing musical dress-up, taking a different style of music or sound, and taking the most surface-level aspects about it and trying to incorporate it into their core sound with very little grace, I guess you could say. Tracks like Two Time, Two Time, Two Time that take influence from a more tropical sound that's been a bit popular in the mainstream in recent years, or something like I Like America and America Likes Me, which takes influence from SoundCloud rap. It just feels very like they're pulling from all these different sounds that don't really have much to do with each other, or the 1975's core sound too, and essentially just taking the most surface level aspects about them and not doing much with them, and it results in some of the worst cuts on this thing. And when the band isn't doing that, they're making some of the most boring songs of their entire career. The lyrics are not a thing I don't care for on this thing. They try to talk about things like technology and the internet, relationships, how these things all tie together, but they don't really end up saying anything new about these things. They just say stuff that you probably already know and have probably already thought about being a human being living in the year 2018, and not to mention the pretentiousness that oftentimes invades the majority of the songs on this thing, especially in the lyrics, can make stomaching some of these tracks a bit difficult at times. The most frustrating thing is that there are some moments on here where the band reminds me that they definitely have the potential to make good material. In fact, the track It's Not Living If It's Not With You is a pretty decent pop song at the end of the day. It's a track that I can enjoy, but if it means returning to the rest of this album along with it, not really worth it in my opinion. Maybe just return to that track on its own, but the rest of this thing, nah, I'm not going to be doing that anytime soon. Moving on from that project, however, the next one on my list is the newest from Jaden Smith, The Sunset Tape's a cool tape story. I didn't really care all that much for Jaden's debut album last year, Sire. I did have, a good amount of problems with it. However, there were aspects to that album that I liked, most notably the production, and I felt that Jaden definitely had a lot of potential there on that project. I felt like with some time, if he fixed some of the problems with that album, he could legitimately drop a good project, or even a great project down the line, so I was still interested in following his career to some extent. However, this new project from him really is lacking in all of that potential that I mentioned earlier. It's like he took Sire and just squeezed out all of the good things about it, really. What few good things were on that one. This is easily one of the most aimless and boring things I've heard all year, and it also lacks that production that I mentioned earlier that made Sire a somewhat enjoyable listen at times. Jaden sounds bored rapping on this thing. He sounds bored singing on this thing. I'm bored listening to this thing. The production is very spacey and moody and airy, and it just doesn't really do a whole lot for me. It's nowhere near as exciting as it was on Sire. It just tries to go for a vibe pretty much, but ends up feeling like this almost 40-minute long bit of nothing at the end of the day. There's just so little to this project worth talking about at the end of the day. There's not much really even here. I mean, sure, I still feel like Jaden could release a good project in the future. I feel like that potential is still in him to some extent. I just don't really think he shows it at all here on this project, which is pretty disappointing given that Sire was showing that potential a lot more, and that was a project he dropped a year before this one. So yeah, I would avoid this one unless you're like a really big Jaden fan or something. But I'm guessing you've already heard it if that's the case. But while Jaden's album was one of the more boring projects I heard this year, it wasn't the most boring, because that honor goes to the next album on my list, the newest double album from Drake, Scorpion. Why Drake decided to drop a double album, of all things, is something I still really can't wrap my head around, because one of the biggest complaints people have had with his music in recent years and his albums is that they're too long and too bloated overall. That's especially a problem I've had with some of his recent works. And he decided to release a double album, his most bloated and lengthy and boring pieces of music to date. You may run into a moment or two here on this project of quality. In fact, the track Nice for What is a pretty decent Drake song at the end of the day, but there's just so little to so much of this album. Despite how long this thing goes on for, there's actually very little worth talking about or caring about packed into that very long runtime. You mostly get your typical Drake songs on this thing, either your typical Drake rap songs or R&B tracks. I guess if you're a massive fan of Drake's sound, maybe you'll enjoy, but to those of us out there who need a bit more than that, these just kind of feel like Drake B-sides for the most part, but it's like 2 discs of Drake B-sides, which isn't very interesting to me. Lyrically, there's not a whole lot to this thing either. He's mostly talking about his typical Drake stuff, like his relationship with women and all that, trying to act tough despite the fact that Pusha T just completely murdered him earlier this year prior to this thing dropping, and also attempting to make some awkward connections with his son, which also are a result of that Pusha T beef, I feel, and like I just said, they come off a bit awkward. So yeah, maybe listen to Nice for What if you like Drake overall, but aside from that, this project has so little worth talking about or caring about on it. I just want to move past it at the end of the day. Next up on my list, I have the newest album from Five Finger Death Punch and Justice for None. Now, I've never been a massive Five Finger Death Punch fan by any means. I feel like they had a lot of potential earlier in their career, but have just kind of squandered that potential over and over again as their career has gone on. However, I had the slightest bit of hope coming into this new project here, considering a lot of the internal turmoil going on in this group following their last album. I was hoping that maybe it would result in some kind of change, maybe a bit of a stylistic change or something like that. Just something different from the Five Finger Death Punch norm that we've been getting with every single one of their last few albums. I had the slightest bit of hope that that would be the case with this new one here, but that wasn't the case. This is just another Five Finger Death Punch album at the end of the day. There's a few cuts on this album where they attempt to address some of that drama going on with the group, but it just comes across really poorly, I guess you could say. These are some of the worst tracks on the album at the end of the day, in my opinion, especially when it comes to that really tough guy attitude that they try to pull on these tracks. It just does not work, in my opinion. It just comes across really forced, really fake, and really laughable at times, too. Like, some of these cuts feel almost like they're self-parody. Like, if you told me tracks like Fake were intended to be self-parody of the group, like the group was self-aware of their previous shortcomings and were trying to make a joke out of it, I could believe it with a track like Fake, but the unfortunate thing is that that's not really the case. They're being dead serious with a track like that. And when they're not doing these painfully, just overly tough guy tracks that aren't really all that believable, they're putting out some of the most boring, safe, and generic radio rock and metal I've heard this year, including a couple of covers that are done really poorly overall. It's just not an album worth checking out unless you really like Five Finger Death Punch and everything they've done before. If you've not been a fan of their past works, especially their more recent works, you feel like they've been really stale overall, this isn't going to change your mind. Next up on my list is an album that many people, myself included, were bracing for coming into this new year. I'm talking about the newest album from Fall Out Boy, Mania. Now, the reason we were all bracing for this album was because a lot of the teasers tracks for this thing weren't particularly great, particularly Young and Menace, which I still believe is an awful song. I still can't believe I'm still talking about this song in 2018, given I reviewed it as a track review back in early 2017. Talked about it again when I reviewed the album, Worst Songs of Last Year List 2. I feel like I can't stop talking about this song. It just keeps coming back into my life, and it just makes me dislike the song even more and more the more I have to talk about it. But yeah, when I got to this actual album itself, I gotta say, it's a little better than I expected it to be. It's still pretty terrible, though. It's a little better than I expected it to be because it's not a bunch of Young and Menaces. Like, if it was Young and Menace from start to finish, this easily would have been, like, my worst album of the year. But fortunately, much of the rest of this album is just really boring, really safe, very overproduced pop rock. Like a lot of what Fall Out Boy have done following their hiatus, but like even more overproduced and safe. And I have nothing against pop music by any means. In fact, Fall Out Boy's earliest material is still pretty poppy overall. But when it comes to their more recent output, particularly this album, I just feel like it's lacking a lot of that heart and soul that made some of their earlier music fairly enjoyable. This thing just feels very soulless. It feels just heartless at the end of the day. And there are a couple moments on this thing, like Young and Menace, that are still just really painful to listen to, too. So yeah, this is by no means a great album, and I hope Fall Out Boy can turn things around with their next release. Next up, I'm going to be talking about the newest album by Imagine Dragons, Origins, another band that I felt like had a lot more potential earlier on in their career, but over time just haven't really lived up to that potential at all. Really, there's not much to say about this album outside of the fact that it sounds like an Imagine Dragons album. Like, if you've heard some of the singles from this thing, or from their last album, Evolve, that dropped last year, and that also made my worst albums of last year list, then you know what this thing sounds like. It's just really boring, really safe, really overproduced, and peppy pop rock that is perfect for white soccer moms who want the least offensive music possible. However, I feel like this album is even worse than their last, even though I really dislike their last one too, just because there are several moments on this thing where the band tries to almost like address the fact that people have been critical of them being sellouts, especially on tracks like Machine on here, where they sing about not being part of a machine. I don't know if they're particularly talking about like the music industry, but they didn't really sell it all too nicely. And then on track Bullet in a Gun later on, they more explicitly reference the whole sellout thing. But considering this track follows a song that appears on the Wreck-It Ralph movie that recently dropped, the sequencing of the tracks here just isn't very good for that argument to work. Like, whoever sequenced these tracks, if it was the band, they really need to pay a bit more attention to how they're sequencing their tracks later in the future. And if it was someone else who wasn't in the band, whoever it was must really hate the band and must have really wanted them to suffer at the cold hands of irony, because the fact that those two tracks are paired back to back just ends up being kind of funny at the end of the day. It'd be pretty funny if the two songs weren't terrible and if I didn't have to listen to them. But yeah, the only good thing I could say is congratulations to Imagine Dragons for making the worst of the year list 2 years in a row, and also to Eminem too. I forgot to say that before. But yeah, those two artists, I guess they're doing something. Not something right, but they're doing something. Before I get into the next pick on the list, it should be kind of obvious at this point, if you're a fan of rock music in 2018, that over the past couple of years or so, we've had many rock bands, especially ones that were popular in the last decade or so, try to make the transition from their more typical sound to something a bit poppy, or something a bit more in line with what gets played on the radio a bit more. And many of these transitions haven't been particularly good. We've talked about a fair amount of them on this list already. We've talked about some of them on last year's list too. And the one we're going to talk about up next is another one of these albums. However, much of the ones I've talked about so far are albums that, at the end of the day, if I could say a good thing about them, it's that they kind of know what they are. They don't think that they're the greatest thing ever or anything like that. They know that they're pop music at the end of the day. I think the guys in Fall Out Boy know that Mania is definitely poppier than anything they've done before, and that it's just pretty much straight up pop music. I could say the same thing for albums like Last Young Renegade from last year, or One More Light from last year too. I think the bands behind them definitely knew what they were putting out. They didn't really try to act like it was some music-changing piece of work that was going to just impact society as a whole or anything quite like that. That's where the next album on my list is a bit different from these albums, because while it is another example of a rock band trying to make the transition into a more poppier sound, they try to do so with a massive amount of pretentiousness at the same time. I'm talking about the newest album from 30 Seconds to Mars, America. As I said before, this thing just feels a lot like a lot of the albums I've already talked about on this list and last year's list. The production on this thing is very modern, very hip-hop inspired. You have a lot of trap influences here too. Just an overall very hazy, very moody feel to it that, you know, isn't done in a way that's super interesting either. None of the songs on this thing are particularly interesting or stand out or anything, but the band treats it like it's this big, grand thing, like they're making a super big and important statement with this album. And there are moments on this thing that try to be politically and socially charged, at least I feel that they're trying to be that way. I'm not 100% sure because they're so vague and simple that they could really be talking about anything. I'm really not 100% sure what in particular they're trying to focus on here because they're so vague at the end of the day. And I'm just very boring as a result of that too. Like, I'm not really all that invested in this album because I don't really care about what it's talking about, because what it's talking about doesn't really feel like it's an actual thing. It just feels like they have a bunch of very loose ideas being pulled together here, but nothing all that concrete. This album is like trying to be the soundtrack to a revolution, but instead it put me to sleep. So it's obviously failing on multiple fronts in that regard. Yeah, I definitely avoid this one. Like I said, in terms of just the sound alone of this thing, it's not all too different from some of the albums I've already talked about on this list, but the pretentiousness just makes it so much worse. Now, for a good portion of this year, I thought America was going to be my worst album of the year. I mean, it's about the same quality as the album that made my #1 spot last year on my worst albums of the year list, so I was hoping I can get through the rest of the year without hearing something as bad or worse. But unfortunately that happened because I did hear my #1 pick. This is an album that is so much worse than the rest on this list. Like, a lot of the albums here, if you were to rearrange them slightly, like move them with an album that's next to them on the list, it wouldn't make all that much of a difference to me. But this one is significantly worse than all the others here on the list somehow. I'm talking about the newest album from Tom Morello, The Atlas Underground. Tom Morello is best known as the guitarist for Rage Against the Machine, Audioslave. He's more recently been involved with the Prophets of Rage supergroup, along with some other members of Public Enemy and Cypress Hill. He's a pretty prolific musician, a pretty well-respected musician too. So why is he at #1 on the worst albums of the year list for me? Well, that would be because this album is a mess, just such a big mess, a mess of epic proportions, really. It's astounding how much of a mess this album really is. This thing has a lot of features on it, as you might expect, given that Tom Morello is a guitarist. You have some hip-hop artists on here, you have some rappers, some rock musicians, which, given Tom Morello's previous music projects, makes sense at the end of the day. In fact, some of the artists that get featured on this thing are artists I happen to particularly like, artists like Big Boy and Killer Mike and the singer of Rise Against. So, you know, in that regard, all things look to a good album here, but there's also a lot of EDM producers featured on this thing too, which is kind of confusing to me before I started listening to this thing. And I don't dislike EDM by any means. I just feel like mixing rock, hip-hop, and EDM music is a pretty difficult thing to do. I mean, some artists can certainly do it out there, but it's by no means an easy task. And Tom Morello proves himself to be someone who can't really mix all these genres together. Even though there's featured artists on this thing I like, they phone in so hard on this thing. Like, I feel like they were all in a contest to see who could phone in their verse the hardest across this thing, and the results are really disappointing here. I mean, I'm not sure who won that contest, but I mean, it really doesn't matter. They all did a pretty good job at the end of the day at phoning it in. These are probably some of my least favorite verses from these particular artists, which, considering that some of these are some of my favorite rappers and artists out there, is really disappointing for me personally. And when it comes to the EDM aspects of the album that are being worked in here, it's just done really awkwardly, and it feels even a bit dated too, given that a lot of the sounds mixed in here feel like they would be a bit more popular, like in 2011 or 2012 or something, not 2018. I haven't really talked about Tom himself up to this point here. That's mostly because he's pretty much a non-presence on his own album for the most part. When he does decide to come in with some guitar work, it's like okay, I guess. Like, it sounds like him, I'll give it that, but it sounds like what it would have been his like warm-up riffs like years ago, even before Rage Against the Machine formed. Like, it's that uninteresting overall. And it's the only aspect about this album that really reminds you that it's his album at the end of the day. The features are definitely more memorable here, for better or for worse, and it's usually for worse. This is just a project that's so difficult for me to wrap my head around. Like, it perplexes me that a project like this could exist, that, there were multiple people who worked on this thing, many of those people being veterans in the music industry with several fantastic releases under their belt, that they all worked on this thing, and they were like, yeah, this is a good product, this is something that should be released and that should see the light of day. It just really blows my mind, honestly. Many albums that appear on Worst of the Year list are albums that frustrate you, that anger you to some extent, maybe that bore you too. But this is an album that really doesn't do any of those for me. It just confuses me, and at times I feel bad for this album. Like, I just legitimately feel bad for the artist involved, but at the same time I don't, because they should know better. It's really, my feelings towards this album are very complicated, I guess you could say. But they're definitely not positive feelings at the end of the day overall. It's just a mess of a listen. It's not even the type of album where it's like so bad it's good. Like, if you're genuinely curious to know what it sounds like, give like one track from this thing a listen. You'll get a good idea of what you're in for, and it doesn't really get any better from there. Yeah, The Atlas Underground, worst album of 2018 in my opinion. Definitely avoid at all costs if you haven't heard it already. But yeah, that's my list, just my own opinion, like I said before. If you happen to like any of these albums, if you happen to think any of them are great, if they're one of your favorites of the year or something, it's perfectly fine. I don't think any less of you or anything. This is just my own personal opinion. If you want to see my further thoughts on some of these albums, I highly recommend you check out a playlist of all my album reviews that's going to be linked in the description down below, because I have reviewed all of these in full, and of course, I couldn't talk about them in complete detail here in this video, because if not, this thing would have gone on for hours. So yeah, check out my full reviews of them if you want to know my further thoughts on many of these albums. But yeah, thank you guys for watching this video. I greatly appreciate if you do the like. Comment down below your thoughts on my list. Did you happen to agree with any of my picks? If not, what were some of your worst albums of the year? Maybe there are albums I didn't hear. Though, if you leave them below, I'm probably not going to check them out, because I don't want to listen to any more bad music. Also, aside from my playlist of album reviews linked in the description down below, is going to be a playlist of all my countdown list of videos on my channel, where all my future year-end countdown lists for the 2018 season are going to be going as they come out, as well as where my 2017 countdown videos already are, along with any of the other countdown lists I've done on this channel in the past. So if you want to check some of those out, please feel free to do so. And also check that out maybe if you're watching this video a few weeks after it's been released, because those 2018 countdowns, the other ones that is, will be in there by that point. Thank you guys for watching this video once again, and stay golden.